In July 1944, while Allied soldiers were dying on Normandy beaches, 730 men in suits gathered at a luxury resort hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. For 22 days, they designed a financial system that would control the world's wealth for the next 8 decades. What they created wasn't just about rebuilding war-torn economies, it was the most successful economic coup in history, executed with handshakes and signatures instead of tanks and guns. By the time these delegates left the Mount Washington Hotel on July 22, 1944, they had given one country unlimited power to print the world's money. That country was the United States, and the currency was the dollar. By the end of this video, you'll understand how America used a 22-day conference to build a dollar empire that still governs every transaction in your bank account today. You'll see the hidden architecture behind modern finance and why every economic crisis since 1944 traces back to this single moment. This is the Bretton Woods Conference, and this is how they made the dollar king. To understand what happened at Bretton Woods, you need to see the world as it existed in 1944. Europe lay in ruins, with an estimated 36 million dead and entire cities reduced to rubble. Industrial production across the continent had collapsed by 70% from pre-war levels. Currency systems had disintegrated into chaos, with rampant inflation making paper money worthless in many nations. The global economy hadn't just broken down, it had been systematically destroyed by 6 years of total war. Britain, once the world's financial hegemon, was drowning in debt and dependent on American loans for survival. France, Germany, Italy, all the great powers of Europe were bankrupt. Their gold reserves depleted, their factories destroyed, their populations exhausted. But America stood alone in prosperity. By 1944, the United States controlled approximately 75% of the world's monetary gold reserves, roughly 22,000 tons stored in Fort Knox and Federal Reserve vaults. American factories hummed with production, having expanded capacity by 50% during the war. The U.S. economy represented nearly half of global GDP, an unprecedented concentration of economic power. This created a power vacuum unlike anything in modern history. For the first time since the Roman Empire, one nation possessed such overwhelming economic dominance that it could literally rewrite the rules of global finance. The question wasn't whether America would seize this opportunity, but how they would structure a system that appeared multilateral while ensuring permanent U.S. advantage. The window for this transformation was narrow. Within months, the war would end, and nations would scramble to rebuild their monetary systems independently. Different visions competed for supremacy. British economist John Maynard Keynes proposed an international currency called the Bancor that would balance power among nations. Soviet planning emphasized state control and rejection of Western capitalism, but U.S. Treasury official Dexter White had a different plan. He envisioned a dollar-centered system where gold backed the dollar and the dollar backed everything else. It was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications for global power dynamics. On July 1, 1944, delegates from 44 Allied nations arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel, a grand resort nestled in New Hampshire's White Mountains. The official name was the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, though history would remember it as Bretton Woods. U.S. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr. opened the proceedings with a stark warning about the failures of economic nationalism that had led to war. The attendees represented a staggering concentration of global economic power. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most influential economist of the 20th century, despite his failing health and heart condition. China, India, the Soviet Union, Canada, and 39 other nations sent their top financial minds. But everyone understood the reality. America held 75% of the world's gold and would dictate terms. The negotiations exposed fundamental disagreements about post-war economic order. Keynes arrived with his Bancor proposal, an international clearing union that would create a new supranational currency to settle trade between nations. Under his plan, each country would receive credit denominated in bankers, preventing any single nation from dominating global trade. Countries running trade surpluses would be penalized, creating pressure to balance international accounts. Dexter White's American plan rejected this multilateral vision entirely. The White Plan proposed an international monetary fund with total initial capital of $8.8 billion, equivalent to roughly $162 billion in 2025 dollars. Member nations would contribute quotas based on their economic size, giving the United States the largest voting share. The dollar would be fixed to gold at $35 per ounce, and all other currencies would peg to the dollar within a 1% band. The debates between Keynes and White became the stuff of economic legend. Keynes argued that White's system would create structural trade imbalances and concentrate power in Washington. White countered that only dollar-gold convertibility could provide the stability needed for post-war reconstruction. Behind closed doors, the Americans made clear that Marshall Plan aid for European recovery would flow most generously to nations that embraced the American monetary framework. On July 22, 1944, after 3 weeks of negotiations, the delegates signed the Bretton Woods Agreement. The final structure closely followed White's American blueprint with minor concessions to Keynes's concerns. 2 new institutions would govern this system: the International Monetary Fund with $8.8 billion in capital, and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, later known as the World Bank, with authorized capital of $10 billion. The agreement's actual mechanics were deceptively simple. The United States would maintain gold convertibility at $35 per ounce, while every other nation would fix their currency to the dollar. If Britain wanted to trade with France, they would use dollars as the intermediate currency. If Japan needed to buy oil, they would pay in dollars. The IMF would provide short-term loans to countries facing balance of payments difficulties. What made this revolutionary wasn't the gold standard that had existed before. The innovation was making one national currency the linchpin of global trade, while giving that nation's central bank the power to issue unlimited amounts of it. America could print dollars to pay for imports, while other nations had to earn dollars through exports or borrow them from the IMF. The implementation phase revealed the system's genius. The IMF came into formal existence on December 27, 1945, when representatives from 29 member countries gathered in Washington to sign its Articles of Agreement. The United States contributed $2.75 billion of the IMF's initial $8.8 billion capital, giving it veto power over major decisions. By June 1946, the World Bank opened for business and made its first loan to France. Countries lined up to join. By 1947, the system included all major non-communist economies. The Soviet Union had sent delegates to Bretton Woods, but ultimately refused to ratify the agreements, viewing them as tools of American imperialism. Stalin's rejection split the world into 2 monetary systems, the dollar bloc and the communist bloc. The Bretton Woods gold standard collapsed on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold. But the dollar empire didn't fall, it evolved. What emerged was even more powerful: a pure fiat dollar system backed not by gold, but by U.S. military power, petroleum trade, and the self-perpetuating momentum of the world's reserve currency. Today, the dollar represents 58% of global foreign exchange reserves, according to 2025 IMF data. The euro, its closest competitor, holds just 20%. This means central banks worldwide hold more than $7 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds and dollar deposits. Every time a country accumulates dollar reserves, it's effectively lending money to the United States at low interest rates. The institutions created at Bretton Woods have grown into financial giants. The IMF now manages over $661 billion in quotas and has issued loans exceeding $1 trillion to member nations during crises. The World Bank Group has become a $100 billion per year operation funding development projects globally. Both institutions maintain their headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the United States retains veto power over major decisions. The hidden architecture of dollar dominance operates through multiple reinforcing mechanisms. The Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT, processes the majority of international payments in dollars. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Western nations used SWIFT as a weapon, cutting Russian banks from the system. This demonstrated both the dollar's power and its increasing weaponization for geopolitical objectives. Global commodities trade remains overwhelmingly dollar-denominated. Oil, gold, copper, wheat. Virtually every major commodity is priced and traded in dollars. This creates constant demand for the currency regardless of trade flows. A Japanese company buying Brazilian iron ore will typically conduct the transaction in dollars, even though neither country is party to the deal. The petrodollar system, established through secret agreements with Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, requires oil exporting nations to price their crude in dollars. This arrangement survived Bretton Woods' collapse and created even stronger dollar demand. Every country needs dollars to buy energy, making the currency essential for industrial civilization itself. Modern debt markets reveal the system's continued dominance. International debt issuance remains 60% dollar-denominated, according to Bank for International Settlements data. Companies and governments worldwide borrow in dollars to access deeper, more liquid capital markets. This creates structural dollar shortage. More entities owe dollars than can easily obtain them, driving perpetual demand. The 2008 financial crisis exposed how deeply the Bretton Woods architecture had embedded itself in global finance. When U.S. mortgage securities collapsed, credit markets worldwide froze because they were all interconnected through dollar funding markets. The Federal Reserve had to establish swap lines providing trillions in dollar liquidity to foreign central banks. This wasn't charity. It was the reserve currency system functioning exactly as designed. COVID-19 stimulus measures demonstrated the exorbitant privilege of the reserve currency issuer. The United States printed $5 trillion in new money from 2020 to 2021, yet faced less inflation than most economies. Why? because dollars circulate globally, allowing America to export inflation through its currency's international use. When the Fed prints money, the world absorbs much of the increase, but cracks are appearing in the foundation. China has established the cross-border interbank payment system as an alternative to SWIFT. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange allows yuan-denominated oil futures. Saudi Arabia has begun discussing non-dollar oil sales for the first time since the 1970s. These aren't yet threats to dollar supremacy, but they represent the early stages of systemic stress. The dollar-centric system faces pressures that mirror those that broke the original Bretton Woods arrangement in 1971. U.S. national debt has exceeded $36 trillion, representing 120% of GDP, higher than at any point except World War II. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from $800 billion in 2008 to over $8 trillion today. These numbers suggest structural imbalances that ultimately prove unsustainable. The Triffin dilemma, named after economist Robert Triffin, who predicted Bretton Woods' collapse, remains unresolved. For the dollar to serve as global reserve currency, America must run persistent trade deficits to supply dollars to the world, but persistent deficits eventually undermine confidence in the currency. This paradox destroyed gold convertibility in 1971, and it threatens fiat dollar dominance today. BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have expanded to include over 40% of global population and 36% of world GDP. These countries openly discuss alternatives to dollar dominance, from a shared BRICS currency to expanded use of local currency trade settlements. While no BRICS currency has materialized, the political will for change is clearly developing. History suggests three possible paths forward. The first is managed transition. G20 nations negotiate a new multilateral system, perhaps based on the IMF's special drawing rights, creating a basket of currencies to gradually replace singular dollar dominance. This would require unprecedented international cooperation and U.S. willingness to surrender its exorbitant privilege. The second scenario is crisis-driven reset. A major shock, debt default, hyperinflation, or financial panic, forces sudden systemic change. Historical precedent from 1944 shows that monetary systems typically reset during or immediately after major conflicts, when old structures have collapsed and power dynamics have shifted dramatically. The third possibility is gradual erosion. The dollar slowly loses market share over decades as alternative payment systems, currencies, and trade arrangements chip away at its dominance. By 2050, the dollar might hold 35% of reserves instead of 58%, creating a multipolar currency system without a single hegemon. Each scenario carries profound implications for average citizens. Managed transition might preserve stability but would reduce American living standards, as imported goods become more expensive without reserve currency benefits. Crisis-driven reset could trigger global depression as financial markets reprice trillions in dollar-denominated assets. Gradual erosion might prove least disruptive, but leaves everyone in prolonged uncertainty. The power shifts underway mirror those of 1944 in reverse. Then, Europe's collapse elevated America. Today, Asia's rise challenges American hegemony. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves and has established currency swap agreements with 40 countries. India's economy is projected to become the world's third largest by 2027. Historical patterns suggest that monetary hegemons don't surrender power willingly. Britain fought to preserve sterling's role long after economic fundamentals had shifted. The transition from pound to dollar took decades and required 2 world wars to complete. If history repeats, the shift away from dollar dominance will be measured in decades, not years, and will likely correlate with geopolitical conflict. Here's what most people miss about Bretton Woods. It wasn't a conspiracy, but it was absolutely intentional. The 730 delegates who gathered in New Hampshire didn't accidentally create dollar dominance. They explicitly designed a system that concentrated financial power in Washington while maintaining the appearance of multilateral cooperation through the IMF and World Bank. The uncomfortable truth is that Bretton Woods succeeded precisely because it aligned economic incentives with geopolitical reality. America had the gold, the industrial capacity, and the military power. The system reflected that reality rather than fighting it. Countries accepted dollar hegemony because they needed American aid for reconstruction and American markets for exports. What conventional wisdom gets wrong is assuming the system was meant to last forever. The architects of Bretton Woods, including White and Keynes, understood that fixed exchange rates would eventually become unsustainable as economies recovered and diverged. They built the IMF's adjustable peg mechanism as a pressure release valve. The system was designed to evolve, which it did when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. 3 key lessons emerge from this history. First, monetary systems reflect power structures more than economic theories. The dollar became king because America won World War II, not because gold-dollar convertibility was economically optimal. Second, all monetary hegemons eventually overextend and face challenges from rising powers. This pattern has repeated from ancient Rome through the British Empire to today. Third, systemic transitions create both winners and losers. The shift from sterling to dollar dominance devastated British living standards, but elevated American prosperity. The next transition will similarly redistribute wealth and power on a massive scale. Understanding these patterns allows you to position yourself for the coming changes rather than being blindsided by them. The pattern that predicts what comes next is simple. Reserve currency status is temporary, not permanent. It lasts decades, not centuries. The average reserve currency has historically maintained dominance for 80 to 100 years. The dollar has held this position for 80 years. This doesn't guarantee imminent collapse, but it suggests we're entering the late stages of dollar hegemony. What happened at Bretton Woods in those 22 days during July 1944 was the financial equivalent of writing a constitution for the global economy. The delegates who gathered there created institutions and structures that shape the world you live in today. Every time you check your bank balance, every time you see currency exchange rates, every time economic crises ripple across nations, you're seeing the legacy of decisions made at the Mount Washington Hotel. The system they created made the dollar king. But history suggests that every king eventually loses their throne. The only question is whether the transition happens peacefully through negotiation or violently through crisis. Bretton Woods was born from the ashes of war. What emerges from its eventual collapse remains to be seen. How $13 billion saved Europe from communism, the Marshall Plan Masterclass. Explore how America used economic aid to cement dollar dominance and win the Cold War before it even began.